things flying off the wall, the refrigerator in the kitchen floating, which I saw myself in their presence. Things of that kind are in about 5 different police reports.
Well, hello there. I am Cool Gray, and this is Cool Gray in Studio A. Welcome back to the podcast. We are in episode 13, which is the 6th and final part of my series called Personal Paranormal Encounters. It has been a ride, and we are going to wrap it up in a big way. Not going to lie, super excited about this particular episode and my guest today. I will introduce him to you in just a moment. We're going to go a little longer than usual today, but I promise you every minute is worth it. I will also tell you up front, the first 15 to 20 minutes is by way of setting up what is going to be just some blockbuster conversation coming up just after that. Stick with this one. Listen all the way through. I promise you will be amazed and you will be thought-provoked and you'll be glad you made the investment of your time today. Little bit of business, not very much, just to remind you that there is a listener survey that I would love it if you would take 5 minutes to hop over to my website and complete. The 10th one to do so will be the recipient of a gift from me, including a personal signed note. So there are links in the show notes that will tell you where that is. And, you know, while you're checking show notes and all that sort of thing, why don't you find and follow me on social media so that you will get exclusive little excerpts and clips from these episodes. You can find those on Facebook, on Instagram, on TikTok. I'm just everywhere. There's no way to get away from the Cool Gray. That was so rhymey. Okay, goofball moment over. I'm going to quit talking. We're going to get right into this episode, and I'll be back on the other side with a parting thought. Joining me today is Paul Eno. Let me introduce you. Paul was one of the first paranormal investigators of the early 1970s, beginning while he was studying for the priesthood. Paul graduated from 2 seminaries, but was expelled from a third about a year before ordination because of his paranormal work. Today, he's an award-winning New England journalist and the author of or contributor to 10 books. He also holds a rare Ph.D. degree in philosophy. Paul serves on the research committee of the Consciousness and Contact Research Institute and on the Experiencer Resource Team of the Mutual UFO Network, otherwise known as MUFON. He's appeared on the Travel, Discovery, and History channels. And among his early mentors are the legendary, though very controversial, first-generation grandparents of ghost hunting, Ed and Lorraine Warren of the Conjuring fame. Paul, I am just not even going to try to pretend that I'm not thrilled that you're here with me today. I'm very excited about this conversation, and thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much, Linda. One correction on the bio.
Yeah.
It's a Ph.B.
What is a Ph.B.? I see that.
It's a European sort of degree, and it's not very common in this country. So,
that's why I messed it up, because I've never heard of it.
Yeah, it's equivalent to a master's.
Interesting.
But,
okay.
Details.
Okay. Well, yeah, we want to get it right.
Right.
Let's just start with a little bit of your background before we get into the meat and potatoes of this conversation. Can you just tell me a little bit about what originally sparked your interest in the paranormal and how you reconciled that with your seminary studies?
Well, I suppose we have to go back to the age of 7 in 1961 when and as you can imagine, this is difficult to talk about. I think we talked about it off the air. I was witness to my father's suicide.
Mm-hmm.
And I was I come from a Yankee family, but by some quirk, we were Roman Catholics. At least my mother was. And I was in a very strict Catholic school with the Sisters of Mercy, quotes. And they were either saints or potential axe murderers, I thought.
Wow.
The one I had in 2nd grade was a saint, thank heaven. And I said, we were learning things like, you eat a hot dog on Friday, you go to hell and commit suicide, forget about it. So I said to her, where is my father? I'm a little kid. And she said, essentially, God is bigger than all that. That really got me through. Okay. I appreciated that.
Yeah.
So As time went by, I wondered, where is my father? There were no strange hauntings in the house like you'd expect with a suicide, that kind of thing. My brother was already in the seminary. He was ordained to the priesthood 2 years later. And I myself entered the seminary at the age of 14 when you could still do that.
Oh, my.
And it was high school level, but start learning philosophy and stuff. And the three seminaries, people say, well, what, don't you just go to one? Well, there were three different academic levels, including undergraduate and postgraduate.
Mm-hmm.
But what I just started to wonder about the doctrine of purgatory. And for Roman Catholics, those who are not quite good enough to go to heaven or not quite bad enough to go to hell, go to purgatory for a while to be purged, hence the name. And there you go. Now, they're kind of embarrassed by that today. But anyway, at the time, it was, a well-known doctrine.
Right.
So I wondered, are these ghosts we hear about in every culture throughout history, are they souls in purgatory? Maybe that's where the idea came from. So I decided to test that out. In 1970, I ran into a newspaper article in the Hartford Courant about an old man, an old historian in Northeast Connecticut, who had, for many, many years, run around this old settlement with a camera and gotten some weird photos. What today we would call streaks and orbs. So I got some seminaries together, got in touch with the guy, and we started that case. Things would happen to us. We would hear the daily lives of people in this long abandoned settlement, and there was no one else living nearby. They seemed not to be dead at all, never mind being in purgatory.
Was it like a ghost town or an open field? What was the environment?
No, it was pretty much a ghost town that had been overgrown by second growth woodland. And there were cellar holes. There was the site of an old mill. There was an old cemetery. But again, these were like living people. And I never said this I was on thin ice in the seminary as was already. I never said this to my colleagues, but I knew the names of some of those people. For example, on the first night, this is in 1971, in August, a hot night, late in the month. So the katydids here in New England were starting to get going. So that was creepy. But we heard the laughing of children down the hill from where we were along the brook where the mill had been. Mm-hmm. And oddly, this was my first experience of the spatial oddities that take place in some of these phenomena. It was as if they were moving rapidly up and down the brook, Nightingale Brook, as if they were in a car, but going back and forth rapidly. And there was no road, no houses, no anything. And I knew the names of some of those children. I don't know how. Years later, I found out in genealogical research that I was related to the Randall family, who were his. So whether that had anything to do with it, I don't know. But many, many things happened. And I immediately began to reevaluate the old ideas about ghosts being dead people and about the theology behind any kind of purgatory thing.
How old were you when you had that experience?
17, actually 18.
Around 18?
I can't do math either. That's why I went to the seminary.
I mean, you have to just work on your strengths, right?
Right.
So is this what you were writing about that caught the attention of the Warrens and sparked that relationship, or was it something else?
Yes, indeed. In 1972, I wrote this all up, and I mentioned the purgatory theory. And one of the people we were working with who knew Lorraine and sent it to her, and she thought this purgatory thing was a spectacular idea. So they got in touch with me and invited me to dinner. So I went down to their house in Monroe, Connecticut. I lived in East Hartford, maybe 60 miles from there. And we had a great visit, found out all about them. They weren't all that well known at that time outside of Connecticut. So I was one of the early people to begin working with them. And I think they liked the idea that I was supposedly going to be a priest, because that was, I guess, kind of useful.
Yeah. Were they Catholic?
Technically, I guess they were. Actually, they were associated with some sort of a non-canonical conservative Catholic group that was headquartered in the area and headed by a French Archbishop, Archbishop Lefebvre. And he had ordained priests and without the authorization of the Vatican. And but they were ultra-conservative Roman Catholics, which brought with it a very I think, very negative spirituality, kind of based on fear and not love. But yeah, I kind of overlooked that. They became very close friends, and being a fatherless boy, Ed and I really kind of bonded that way. So that's how we started out. 1972 was right after their Conjuring case. So I wasn't involved in that. But until 1978, I was involved in most of the cases, with the exception of Amityville, because I was in the seminary at the other end of New York State at the time. But Lorraine wrote me letters during that case.
Fascinating. I could have a whole separate podcast just talking about how you reconcile. Oh, you're up to your neck in theological and philosophical study, and at the same time having these extraordinary events that seem to fly in the face of some of the things you're being taught in a formal setting. Can you talk and you were young. What was that tension like for you? I hear you saying you switched to the Orthodox Church, but I don't hear you saying that you abandoned your faith. So tell me how those things coexist for you.
Well, I always will respect the Roman Catholic Church because that's where I learned to love God. My formal studies didn't concern a lot of this. Nobody ever talked about purgatory. I mean, I was in the seminary for 10 years, or seminaries. Purgatory never came up. I was told, had I made it to my 4th year of Roman Catholic theology, when everybody's a deacon in your class, they would bring up about some of this stuff. I understand that today it is more freely discussed, but I'm not really in touch with that. In the Orthodox seminary, which I joined in 1975, the attitude was, you're a new convert, keep your nose in your books and stay away from the Warrens. They didn't like that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I didn't really see much tension because the two subjects weren't really mentioned. The subject of the paranormal or exorcism and that sort of thing wasn't really mentioned, except in 1973. Now I'd already been involved in this, but my Bishop John Marshall of the Diocese of Burlington, Vermont, was not pleased about this. I think he sent me to the most remote seminary he could find to keep me out of mischief, beginning of major seminary, the last 2 years of college, where you had to study philosophy. So he sent me to Wadham's Hall Seminary in upstate New York on the Canadian border, figured to keep me out of mischief. But it didn't, because he didn't figure on Father Lawrence. Well, in the book, I call him Father Lawrence Wheeler, but he was the exorcist for the Diocese of Ogdensburg, who happened to live at the seminary. And he found out about me, and he found out about the Warrens, me working with the Warrens.
Right.
He didn't teach. It turns out he was the Catholic chaplain at the what was locally called the Ogdensburg Asylum for the Insane. And it was actually the St. Lawrence State Hospital up the road. But he was also doing exorcisms there when it was called for. Long story short, I ended up working with him as an assistant, along with several of the hospital staff. That was where I really got my feet wet in this subject. But academically, I don't know if the rest of the faculty even knew about this. The academic dean at the seminary set up a special course for me in abnormal psychology, because they were rather sympathetic to my paranormal work.
Fascinating.
And
wow.
that course would help me decide who's possessed or having paranormal experiences, who's just plain nuts.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't really work that way. But in any case, they were sympathetic, and I ended up really getting thrown into the deep end when it came to exorcisms with Father Lawrence.
So rather than flying in the face of what you were learning, it actually became a part of it. How did that lead to expulsion?
I later that year thought the Orthodox Church was more authentic to the original Christian teaching. I'd learned some Greek, and it seemed like it jived a little better. Uh-huh. So while they were very sympathetic, I joined the Orthodox Church that summer. I happened to be at the right academic level to go into the graduate theological program at St. Vladimir Seminary in New York. And that's when they laid the law down that they didn't want me doing this. But I did it anyways. And at one point, 2 years later, a student accused me of doing an exorcism on him, which was complete nonsense. I would never do that, not even today. And out I went. They didn't even want to talk to me. So I called the rector of the seminary, Father Alexander Schmemann, who was a distinguished theologian. I said, Father, what are you doing? I didn't do that. So I went down to talk to him. He was very sympathetic. He said, you want to come back and study, right? I said, yes, but they never readmitted me. I mean, what is that? So
do you feel like that was some kind of orchestrated event with a hidden agenda?
Oh, possibly, because there were other things going on. I was involved in the military reserve. They didn't like that either. But in any case,
Wow.
I figured, I can take a hint. So I thought I maybe better look elsewhere for my future. So the only other thing I could do was write. So I ended up a journalist. I'd never taken a journalism course in my life. The only other paper that would talk to me was a little daily newspaper in Rhode Island that I later found out was considered the worst daily newspaper in New England by the editorial. But anyway, I got my foot in the door and I managed to be successful, and I ended up a minor editor at the Providence Journal. And I've had a really great career, and I'm still a working journalist.
And are you still a working paranormal investigator as well?
Oh, yes. I consider that part of my work as a journalist.
Yeah. So it seems to me, and we'll dive into this more a little bit later on in the conversation, that you're uniquely positioned with your study, and more study than the average bear, in theology, in psychology, or philosophy, and with journalism. That's kind of a really fascinating trifecta that puts you in combination with your on the scene, in the field experiences, to come up with what I think is one of the best working theories about just what in the heck is going on with all of this paranormal phenomenon. And I'm fascinated with what you've come up with. I'm just going to put a pin in that because we're going to come back to it after we talk about the Bridgeport event. But I have such a fascination with what you've come up with to help us wrap our minds around this entire world. And honestly, what I'm trying to do with this series I'm doing right now, since my podcast is not exclusively aimed at a paranormal audience, is just to stimulate people to think more deeply about this, instead of having that knee-jerk reaction, or maybe reading the first paragraph of an article, or watching half an episode of Ancient Aliens and then deciding how you feel about the entire thing. I think in this day and age, with clickbait and social media and granular media that can be consumed on demand, that we don't really take time to pause, reflect, think something through, and really come up with an informed opinion about something. And that's one of the reasons I'm so excited to talk to you. I almost want to jump ahead and sink my teeth into that whole thing, but let's come back to that after we talk a little bit about Bridgeport. Now, I was raised in the Northeast, as was my husband, and both of us were just flabbergasted that we did not know about this event when it happened. We knew about Amityville, but we didn't know about this. So I'm assuming the vast majority of my listening audience also doesn't know about this event. Would you give us your description of what happened on that day in Bridgeport?
Sure. It was 1974. It was November 24th. And I was home from the seminary that week for Thanksgiving vacation. And Lorraine invited me down for dinner. It was supposed to be just a quiet dinner with she and Ed. So I get down there. They lived in the house is still there, a kind of little cul-de-sac in the middle of the woods. And I get out of the vehicle, and Lorraine comes leaping out the door and said, "Are you in a high spiritual state right now?" And actually, I was in a terrible spiritual state because I was in the middle of trying to decide whether to join the Orthodox Church. So naturally, I said, "Yeah, everything's ducky. What's going on?"
Right.
Yeah. So she filled me in that there was a poltergeist outbreak at this little house in Bridgeport, maybe 10 miles away. So, and Father Bill Charbonneau, whom I had never met before, was on the way as well. So the four of us ended up going down to this very little bungalow on Lindley Street in Bridgeport. And there were police all over the place.
Already on site when you arrived?
Oh yeah. This had been going on for, the noises had been going on for many months. And
Wow.
It had really gone crazy the previous day when stuff started falling over. And when I walked in there was the place was a mess. Things had been torn off the walls. There was a Marcy, the little girl, adopted 10-year-old daughter of this middle-aged couple. She had a toy baby carriage, and the people told me had ripped stuff out of drawers, clothes, and put it in the baby carriage and started wheeling it around the house because they couldn't see anything. Knives were flying through the kitchen. One of the most interesting things about this is that the police officers put in their report with the things they'd seen. And I walked in there. As a matter of fact, I spoke to him last week. We were supposed to get together, but I was a little under the weather last Saturday. Officer Joseph Tomek, and he had some fascinating experiences in that house. But essentially, we considered it a demonic attack, and that an exorcism of the house would be necessary. That was our assumption. Father Charbonneau, a priest, had been in there earlier. Their parish priest had blessed the place. Father Charbonneau blessed the place. Well, I don't know where to begin about the things that happened. We were there for the better part of 3 days. There were at one point members of the public would just walk in and look around, because one of the first things Ed Warren did was inform the press about this.
You're saying they would walk into the home while these people were living there?
Yeah, and the cops are standing right there. And finally, the police got wise to this, and they put somebody at the door not to let anybody in. It was like a tourist attraction.
Oh, my goodness.
So Ed informs the press, so reporters started to arrive. And this one went out on the wire services. It was literally all over the world. But it had a kind of a short shelf life, which is why because the police stomped on it.
Why we didn't hear about it. Yeah, because they put the kibosh on it.
Just one example, supposedly Sam the cat, whom the little girl Marcy said was her only friend. I mean, you're starting to see a pattern here of isolation and almost abuse, could talk. I wasn't born yesterday, but you should hold the cat up to her neck and kind of do a ventriloquist kind of thing. But I must say, in my entire journalism career, I've never seen a weirder sight than reporters from CBS, NBC, and ABC, because New York wasn't far away. They came up standing around, holding microphones up to the cat and begging it to say something.
So let me stop you there for 1 second. The police officer that claims to have witnessed this put it in his official report. It's documented that he is claiming he heard this cat speak.
Well, that wasn't in the report. The things flying off the wall, the refrigerator in the kitchen floating, which I saw myself in their presence.
Yeah.
Things of that kind are in about 5 different police reports.
So, but the cat incident was one officer's anecdotal verbal account.
Well, also Mr. Gooden, that was the family name, Jerry Gooden, who seemed to be a feet on the ground kind of, the salt of the earth kind of factory worker guy, told me that that cat he said he wouldn't believe it either if he hadn't heard it. The cat would come up to the top of the stairs, pound on the stairs from the cellar, demanding to be let out, and calling him a dirty Frenchman, a dirty rat. He said that hadn't happened until the cat went to the vet for an operation. And he said he must have swallowed a minor bird or something.
I have to say, that is the one detail of this entire story that I'm just not, it just is not computing for me.
No, nor did it with me.
Yeah.
But that's window dressing to the actual case.
Yes, for sure.
Certainly the most dramatic thing that ever happened to me there was on the Monday night. This is the day after we arrived. And the Warrens had gone off to do some TV interview. And I was in the house alone with the family. And because of the press coverage, there were 2,000 to 3,000 people gathered outside this house on the street.
Oh, my goodness.
And the police had to do crowd control. I got the feeling from the minute I stepped through the door that there were 4 entities there. I don't know why, I just did. So sure enough, on that Monday night, I was playing Monopoly with Marcy in the corner of the living room. Now, Ed Warren had asked me to keep an eye on Marcy to make sure she wasn't doing any of these things herself. Like a 10-year-old's going to flip a giant armchair, that kind of.
Right.
So 4 entities arrived in the kitchen. There was sort of a gauzy, cloud-like structure in there. And today, I would refer to that as perhaps a time storm from Jenny Randall, the British researcher. That's her term.
How did you determine that there were four? How did you distinguish?
I just felt there were four.
It was an intuitive.
It's like,
yeah.
It's like there are four people in the room. You can feel them. You can see them.
Uh-huh.
I don't know.
Right.
Maybe you want to use the P word, psychic. I don't know. So
I'm okay with the P word.
Okay. Well, I think it's got a lot of baggage, so I try not to apply it to myself.
Yeah.
But in any case, I guess it is what it is. So they were coming up the hallway, and you could see these, like, I call them gauzy because they're a dirty white kind of thing. One of them came and stood right in front of me. I put the girl behind me, and we had started to read a prayer. And I put the girl behind me because I knew it was after her. And this is where I learned the hard way. You do not get angry, annoyed, or frightened in front of these things because they feed on it. And that's where I started to develop my parasite theory, but not before I became angry and annoyed. And I just instinctively kind of pushed against it because I felt I was trying to protect this girl. The thing pushed back. It was a physical structure. It had a skeletal structure behind it. And I just, that didn't compute.
What you were seeing was not entirely solid, but what you were feeling seemed to have more mass than what you could see with your eyes.
Exactly. Exactly. And it got around me, threw Marcy across the room.
Oh.
She ran back screaming, and it was very upsetting. The place was so full of energy that it felt like it was going to explode. And one of the oddest sidebars to that story was that when the structure started to form in the kitchen, Jerry Gooden went into the kitchen, and all of a sudden he started moving around and singing in a beautiful bass voice in Latin. And it sounded to be like something from the funeral mass. And I've never quite figured that out. I asked him later. He said, well, I was an altar boy. I thought of being a priest. And I said, no altar boy picks up that kind of Latin just by serving mass. In the old days, back during the Trident.
Jerry was the husband who lived in the home.
Yeah, yes, and the father
of Marcy.
The adopted father of Marcy, yeah.
Right.
So in any case, I figured I better let that lie for now, and I pulled everybody out of the house because it seemed that the things just had to dissipate. So fortunately, the police had blocked off each end of the block that we didn't walk out in the middle of a huge crowd. No cell phones in 1974.
Right.
So I went to the neighbor's house to try and to use the phone. I called the Warrens. It took them an hour to drive the 10 miles back into the city. Other things that happened during that case. At one point on Sunday night, I was standing there. There was a police officer present, and I was sitting with Lorraine at the kitchen table. This is on tape because a radio reporter was interviewing Ed about the case at the time. And we're all in the kitchen. All of a sudden, Lorraine kind of let out a little yelp, and I watched as a second-degree burn blister appeared on her hand, right between the thumb and forefinger. And Ed kind of freaked. He said that Lorraine's spontaneous human combustion could take place here. I want you out of this house. And she refused to leave. And you can hear my youthful voice on the tape saying, there's a blister forming. As a matter of fact, the Travel Channel just aired that a few months ago. And then at another point, I was standing with Marcy in the kitchen. People were there who saw this. The floor model television flipped over, hit me in the leg, and a nice gash to show for it, and knocked me and the girl across the kitchen. So things like that were going on. In the bathroom, things didn't stop. Things were falling off shelves into the bathtub. A little table did a flip. I
believe there was an entire refrigerator that levitated itself as well. Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, that's pretty remarkable. I can't understand how anybody might think Marcy was responsible for something like that.
Exactly. So on Tuesday, we had to get some sleep and this kind of thing. So I was going to head home just to take a shower. It's a 60-mile trip. Mrs. Gooden and Marcy were hugging us. Make sure you come back this afternoon. Don't leave us. So off I go, and I'm listening to WABC in New York, and they were saying that the case had been a hoax. The police had declared it so, and apparently they'd gone in right after we left and laid the law down to the Goodens because the city was literally tied up in knots traffic-wise. So Chief Superintendent Walsh said, this ends here. This is it. As Ed Warren said, not only did he make fools out of us, he made fools out of his own officers. because they were filing these reports that were public record. So I went back to the house later, and a policeman threw me off the property. So I didn't know what to do. I went to the Warrens' house, and we kind of tried to regroup, and there were reporters calling from as far away as Australia. As I found out later on, according to Ed, Marcy was taken to the Fairfield Hills State Hospital for psychiatric examinations. Things supposedly happened there. Mr. Goodner had to sink the Christmas tree that year in concrete because it kept moving, and there were many other aspects to it. And finally, a for sale sign appeared, and they finally managed to sell the place. But I think probably the best documented poltergeist case perhaps in history.
So my understanding is now you and possibly a police officer or two are the only people who've survived this event and are here to continue to tell this tale today. The Warrens have passed, and the entire Gooden family has passed, correct?
Yeah, yes, that's true. Even Marcy died in 2014 at the age of 56, I believe. Very sad story. She had a very sad life after this.
Mm-hmm.
And
did you stay in touch with her?
No, actually, I didn't. You know how I found this out was through Bill Hall, William J. Hall, author of the book on this subject, The World's Most Haunted House,
right,
which brought this back into the public eye. Because I only wrote about it in chapters of 2 books, and Bill really brought it forward. And now with the new interest in the Warrens, that the case is kind of front and center. So I'm about the only one left, except for a few police officers, notably Officer Tomek, now in his 80s and retired in Florida, and 1 or 2 others, but that's pretty much it.
What did you make of what was happening at the time? I know that you've evolved your personal theories over the years, but in the moment while that was going on, as a young seminary student and paranormal investigator, what were you thinking in the middle of all of that?
Well, I thought it was what I was told, that it was demonic and that we had to do an exorcism. However, in my personal encounter with these critters on that Monday night that I described, I didn't get a feeling of evil. The word that describes it best was alien. Totally other. Didn't seem human or ghost or anything like that. Certainly not the standard parapsychological explanation of a thought form, produced by Marcy. Hostile, hungry, parasitical, and alien. Now, it's funny because I'll lecture today and people will say, oh, you have a seminary background, you must think all aliens are demons. I said just the opposite. At the risk of being simplistic, I found that all demons are aliens, in a broad sense of the term alien.
Yeah, well, they're certainly not us, are they? So
no. Well, I'm going to say they fell off some flying saucer, UFO, but alien in a broad sense can mean something very much other and from somewhere or somewhen else.
And it sounds like you're saying you're using the term parasite, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. There was, it seems, a malevolence there, but if I'm following your train of thought, and correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like you're maybe suggesting that it's not so much coming from just pure evil intent, that it came from a hunger, that this is just what they need in order to, this is how they survive, is by feeding off of this energy, the fear and the anger and that kind of thing. Not that they necessarily, this kind of superhero movie concept that we all have, that there's the good guys and the bad guys, and the bad guys just simply want to destroy everything for its own sake, for no other reason. They're just here to mess up the world. But it sounds to me like maybe this is just like, if I need to eat something, I'm going to do what I need to do to get some food. And is that kind of what you're suggesting here?
Really, pretty much that's the basics of it. I think that these are part of nature. And remember that they fill the bill in the notion of demon. All right. We put labels on things in the human experience that we can understand. And demon is one of those.
Right.
The psychic is another term that we can understand, but we really don't understand it. I mean, the deeper reality may not be covered at all by the label we put on it. And we're always saying, in the words of our dear friend Mark Antonio, today's paranormal is tomorrow's science. So I think there are many things we don't understand that we try to, and one of these is the theology associated with demons. Now, a funny thing about the word demon, Christianity kind of demonized the term demon in the sense that, well, you say daemon, Daemon,
right? Mm-hmm.
yeah, was actually a rather respectable term for particularly the Greek philosophers, Socrates and others. Plato all said they had their own daemons, which in our terms today might mean the higher self kind of thing.
Or my concept was that it was kind of like a muse or almost a guardian
Yeah,
angel.
muse.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sort of thing. Yeah, guardian angel is a good term. Yeah. So I think that the labels are not good enough. And this is what I was finding, that the demon theology that we were operating on wasn't good enough to explain what we were seeing. The parapsychology wasn't good enough to explain what we were seeing.
We like to fancy ourselves authorities. You know, we are, especially in the church, if you're talking about exorcists, they're seen by the rest of us as the authority in this area, the one with the ability, the knowledge, the power to come in and deal with something that the rest of us feel completely overwhelmed by. But if even at that level, if the exorcist doesn't understand what it is that he's dealing with, then how in the world is he going to effectively deal with it for the safety of the people involved? Was an exorcist performed on Marcy?
No, it wouldn't have been on Marcy. I mean, I could see that sort of thing might have been judged necessary later, had this come, full circle. But it was going to be on the house. But no, it never was. Just those two blessings. The Bishop of Bridgeport would have had to give permission for that. And Roman Catholics have the exorcism very, very much institutionalized.
Yeah, it's not something that's done casually.
Not at all. And there's a good reason for that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you hear about exorcisms in many countries, less developed countries, by whoever is doing them, and people end up dead or severely injured.
Yeah.
And so your imagination can really take over here, and you end up going haywire.
Sure.
So I can see that the strict control is not a bad idea. On the other hand, the Diocese of Bridgeport just recoiled at all the press coverage, and just wouldn't help us out. We were there for the better.
That would have been a pretty big PR event, I imagine.
Yeah,
if it had gone ahead.
Now, had Ed not called in the press, maybe we could have gotten something done that way.
Yeah,
because Father Charbonneau was prepared. I even called an Orthodox priest I knew, and he said, "Well, they really ought to have recourse to their own church first, but if all else fails, I'll come in." But, the police came in and threw us out of the case before I had a chance to bring him in.
Was this your first time in the field actually working a case with the Warrens, or had that happened before?
Well, Ed would hand me cases that he didn't have time for or wasn't interested in. I went to a few houses with them previously, but nothing like this. This is the first major case that I worked with them on.
After that, how long did you continue to work alongside them? And were you doing your own investigations that they were not involved with at all?
Yes. I worked with the Warrens from 1972 to 1978. And by the time 78 rolled around, I'd become Orthodox. They'd thrown me out in 77. And I didn't blame the Warrens for that. That I should have kept my mouth shut about this. But there was that. And Ed, they were very supportive. However, our theories were beginning to really diverge, because at this point, I was running into people who were seeing ghosts of themselves. People who would report buildings being there one day and not the next. And I said, this is really beyond dead people. It's beyond the theology. And I was starting to get into quantum mechanics, reading some books on that. And I said that this whole multiverse idea of all possibilities existing side by side, and all that implies about death and life and spirituality and everything else. I said, that really seems to be the way to go. So Ed handed me a case in Rhode Island, where ironically I live today. He said he didn't have time to continue with it. So I went down there with a couple of people, priests, two priests, and another fellow from the Orthodox Church. The woman said that Ed had left these weird bottles with some kind of strange liquid in it to just tide her over.
Like potions?
No, it struck me like voodoo stuff.
Hmm.
I said, what the heck is this about? And so we took them and we threw them away. But I wrote to Ed and I said, well, what's this about? I don't get it. So as close as we were, you didn't question the gods of paranormal research.
Right.
But there is a kind of a phenomenon, little known among paranormal investigators, that if you want to get rid of somebody because you don't believe anything's really going on, you do stuff like that. You give them some placebo or something that makes them think everything's going to go away. So apparently that's what he was doing, but I didn't think that was ethical. But if you don't think something's going on, you tell somebody and you cut them off if you have to, but you don't do stuff like that. So he didn't like me questioning him. So he called me. We had exchanged a few words and he hung up on me. And then he called back about 5 minutes later. He apologized. He said, you're like a son to me. This just hit me there. Let's meet up and talk about this. So we both had a favorite ice cream place at this mall, kind of between where we lived. And we met there, and we parted with a handshake, but I never saw them again.
Did you talk to him about your multiverse theory in that conversation?
It had started to form at that point, and I was mentioning that, yeah. And he said, you studied all the theology in the seminary all these years, and now you're going over to that. I said, well,
they're not mutually exclusive.
No, can be misinterpreted.
Right.
And I told him what I just told you. I was already using the term, labels that we can understand. I guess it's not just Ed. There were many scientists who spent $100,000 on a degree, and then somebody comes along and questions it. You don't like that. It's human nature. So we parted as friends, but I never communicated with them again. When Ed passed, I think it was 2012, I sent a card to Lorraine, but she was very elderly by that time. But we were very close, and it was very sad for me.
Mm-hmm.
But, you move on. It is what it is. And if you look at their theories today and those who carry on their work, they're the same as they were then. Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm wrong, but I've had amazing results from these new theories, and then finally starting in 2005 with my son, Ben.
Of course, you have a lot more book learning as well as field experience than I do. One of the things that I'm really kind of coming to incorporate into my day-to-day approach to just living is being okay with uncertainty, is not feeling, I came out of 17 years in the Christian church myself, where I had a great deal of confidence that I knew beyond anybody's ability to question what the truth is, and that anybody that didn't agree was just sadly wrong. And I've come to a place in my life now where I'm realizing that there's so much for us to think about. We can't possibly understand everything in this universe. And now we're being exposed to this notion that we may not even be the only universe. So I have a very strong feeling that there's going to come a day when I'm no longer in this vessel, that I will have my moment where I get to say, okay, so that's what that was all about. And I'm not going to get that moment until this life is over. That's just my personal feeling about it right now. And so in the meantime, the way to do this segment of my existence, my eternal existence, is to be okay with the fact that we just don't know so much, and to be okay with that. It doesn't mean we shouldn't try, and we shouldn't read, and we shouldn't explore, and we shouldn't roll theories around in our heads, but to always be open to the possibility that maybe there's still something to discover. There's maybe still something we hadn't considered that would complete the picture for us. And it sounds like you've kept that kind of openness. You have some very well-formed ideas based on everything that you've studied and everything that you've witnessed with your own eyes. But I do get the impression that you're still kind of that enthusiastic explorer. One of the things I like to say about this podcast is what I'm doing with these interviews is I'm turning over rocks and poking stuff with sticks. And I don't think we should ever outgrow that, personally. So good for you for actually coming up with an innovative explanation for what's going on. And we've kind of danced around that a little bit. Let's kind of sink our teeth into it a tiny bit. You're talking about quantum mechanics and the multiverse theory, which used to be non-existent. When I was growing up, I had never even heard the term before. But then I guess around the 70s, that theory started to come out in books and people were reading about it. I remember reading about it then. And the concept isn't so elusive to us anymore. If you mention the multiverse to anybody who's watched Netflix, somebody has seen a movie somewhere where that concept is in there, or a television series where that concept is something we can entertain in our brains. You have applied that to pretty much all the phenomena. It turns out it kind of presents an elegant explanation that's real plausible, in my view, to any paranormal phenomena that you can mention. So let me close my mouth for a minute and give you an opportunity to just give us, can you paint that picture for the audience as to how you think it's all working when we see these extraordinary things around us?
I think that, at least from my own experience, people, again, have a very limited understanding through no fault of their own. They don't know about this sort of thing. In our experience, when you see a ghost, okay, why is it that very often they are dressed doing physical things? In that case in Connecticut that I mentioned initially, the physical things were going on. We were hearing people talking, dogs barking. We heard an ox cart driver go by. We couldn't see him, but he was yelling and cracking a whip. We could hear the hoof beats and the wooden wheels.
Wow.
That's what really got me wondering, maybe this is more about time or space-time than it is about death. In a multiverse where, if this is true, all possible possibilities do exist in concrete reality, and all time is simultaneous, past and future are illusions, how can there be death? How can you ever not be in your current facet or mind? One illustration that I like to use took place while I was lecturing at Mount Ida College near Boston many years ago. And I got a kick out of the fact that half the students were studying to be undertakers because they had merged with a New England embalming school or something. And I'd been talking about human relationships in the multiverse. And at the end, they put me in a big chair like Santa Claus, and the students came up and told me their own stories. Well, two freshman girls came up, and they were two peas in a pod, you could tell. And they said, why is it that we never seen each other before? And registration day, we saw each other. We were sisters from the first moment we saw each other. And I said, well, if our theories are correct, at some point in the multiverse, you are one another, because they're all possibilities. We have had to come up with terms just to talk about this stuff. And there's a glossary at the beginning of my last book, Dancing Past the Graveyard. One of the terms is super life. And within the super life, it's all the lives you were living in the multiverse. There could be millions, billions, trillions of these, and that's all part of your subconscious. Each facet is part of your super life. One of the examples we use is Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. At the age of 4, he sat down and started composing brilliant piano concertos. Now, how could he do that if he was not in touch with where he already is, a brilliant composer somewhere else in the multiverse or somewhere else? So it really is a difficult concept to get your mind around. But then again, is it? People come up to me after lectures, or up to us, Ben and me, and say, I never understood this before, but I recognize this. Or this is how it happened to me all my life. Now I understand it, and I don't have to be afraid of it anymore. And so I hope we're right, because those are wonderful things to hear. So I think we're dealing with a vast life across many, many, many worlds, many of which are quite alien, quite different laws of physics. And laws of physics might explain why that refrigerator floated in that Bridgeport house, because perhaps we were passing through many intersect points where the laws of physics were different, and maybe the refrigerator, excuse me, was weightless for just a few moments and floated in front of.
Yeah, you in your theory, you talk a little bit about what you call flap areas where
Yes,
different universes are actually overlay one another, and therefore there's kind of like a bleed. So like these parasite entities that you mentioned back in Bridgeport, it sounds to me like that could be an example of one of those things where those entities don't belong to this universe, but we were able to interact, or you were able to interact with them in a very real and tangible way for a period of time. Whether or not
yes.
they were able to create those conditions to make that possible, or something else happened to create that overlap. What do you think was going on there?
Well, we're all multiversal creatures, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
I think the whole point of spirituality, any spirituality, is to become more multiversal, more aware. The parasites are part of nature. We've identified about 9 different species of them, from top shelf down to brats or
When
tricksters.
you say we, what are you referring to there?
Oh, my son and myself.
Your son and yourself.
Yeah. And, I starting in that Bridgeport house
Mm-hmm.
and applying those ideas to other cases where people think it's demonic and it's actually parasitical, which is really pretty much the same thing.
Yeah, they're
Uh,
labels. Mm-hmm.
yeah, labels. And I think as a result, we are dealing with a creature that is part of nature, but is like a cosmic mosquito. They are not good for us. They, as I say, they fill the bill of the demonic concept, but whether they're working for, Satan or something like that is another question. They do seem to have a culture. There seem to be several different species. At times they have leadership, some dominating others. There seem to be genders. So it's really quite fascinating.
What you're
But
describing right now, when you're saying they seem to be, you're talking about entities that you and your son, either collectively or separately, have personally encountered in field investigations. So you're not
exactly.
just making up stuff. You're encountering things, and then you're coming back and applying your theory to what you encountered, and you're kind of codifying it so that it can be hopefully better understood. Would that be correct?
Yeah, precisely. And with the caveat that the first thing we say is we could be wrong. You have to keep a certain amount of humility here.
Of
Uh,
course.
as an aside, I am stupefied by the amount of politics in this field. I mean, don't people realize the awesomeness of what we're dealing with? There's all sorts of politics and feuds and intrigues in the paranormal community, including the UFO community. And I don't understand it. Where's the humility? Humility makes you honest, makes you be able to see things more clearly. Ego just clouds the
Is
issue.
that about the race to be noticed and recognized and
Oh yeah,
a
everybody wants their own TV
self-promotion?
show. Yeah,
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
so.
yeah.
Yeah,
And that's
because
unfortunate. I wonder, have you had a chance to talk to any physicists and hard scientists about
oh yes.
applying this theory to the paranormal? And what kind of feedback have you gotten?
Well, they don't all interpret the multiverse in the same way. However, we've had the likes of Dr. Fred Allen Wolf on our show, and he has pretty much agreed with us. Professor Ramit Goswami doesn't agree with us completely, but he's in there, So, and I always say to them, this is not something we learned in a classroom. It's as you said, Lynn, that we are applying what we feel are the most logical answers to what we've experienced and that I've experienced over more than half a century.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and people can take it or leave it.
Why do you think so many of us can go through our entire life and never have an experience of any kind that we could consider paranormal or supernatural? Nothing where we go, gee, I just don't know how that happened. And there are other people where it just seems to be part of their broadcloth. That's just their day-to-day existence is full of these kinds of extraordinary experiences. Would that be part of the would that be attached to a physical location where there's like a flap that you were talking about, or is it the person and their intuitive abilities? What do you think?
Well, I don't know if that's entirely accurate. I think everyone has their stories. I think where you live, the kind of person you are, may determine how much of that experience you have in your life. But I think if you get to the point where you can really personally get to know someone, everyone has their stories. They might not know how to interpret them. They might not consider them paranormal. But when you look at them from your own experience, you could see it might be such a small thing, and people might walk into their kitchen, put their car keys down on the counter. They turn around, answer the phone. They look back, and the car keys are at the other end of the counter. That could be a little multiversal blip, because the multiverse is kind of like Swiss cheese.
That's a good explanation. Yeah, we write it off. We don't.
Yeah, it's one of those things.
Yeah.
Or as the guy says in Close Encounters, well, what things, And so I think that it's a normal part of life. And I'll add this: if everybody was not psychic, quote unquote, to a certain degree, our species would never have survived. You never know that the saber-toothed cat is on the ledge behind you thinking about lunch.
Yeah.
If you didn't have these feelings, we would never have survived.
Yeah, it's not part of our world because it's spooky. It's here because we need it.
It's a survival mechanism.
Sure. Yeah. I know when I think about the multiverse, I do spend time actually thinking about if I am a facet on a super version of me. I have sat and spent time thinking about that from time to time because I'm just that kind of nerd. I can very easily get overwhelmed. You take that and you start multiplying, and very quickly it can become almost more than our brains can handle and process. And I get to that point and I usually giggle. It's like, oh, there it goes. I just went beyond my ability to comprehend. I think about an experience that I've had that I'm actually thinking about doing a separate episode about, where I've counted up the number of times in my life where something has happened where I could have, and in some cases believe that I should have, lost my life. And I polled some people in my social network a while ago saying, have you ever had an experience where you could have died or you feel like you should have and you don't know how you managed to survive that moment? And a lot of people came back and said, oh yeah, once or twice. I have 7 of those in my life. When I counted it up, 7 specific moments where I can say it really should have been all over for me in that moment. And I don't know why it wasn't. And anytime I come up with I don't know why things are happening this way, I can look at the multiverse theory and apply it, and everything suddenly seems to make sense. It's like, well, because it did happen somewhere else, and I'm feeling some kind of resonance from that. I find that to be elegant, satisfying, plausible, and a lot of fun to think about. But when I think I gave you an example about beads. I was stringing beads onto a needle one day, and I had a little pile of them, and I picked up a single bead and thought to myself, what if I hadn't picked up that bead? What if I'd picked up the bead next to it? And in some other universe, I did. And if I've got 150 beads and any combination of those order of something as simple as stringing them, there's nothing, cosmically relevant about that. But if I selected this bead in one universe and this bead in another, there's 150 different iterations of that. And then whatever I did next, then it just multiplies and multiplies. And very quickly you can get your mind blown. And I find very little to be more delightful than that.
I think you're right. We have case after case after case with that. One of them from my son, Ben. We used to have a funny little yellow convertible with a black top. Our neighbors called it the Bumblebee. And he would take his girl out, who's now his wife, and drive up toward Worcester, Mass. And all. At one point, it was raining very heavily, and he hydroplaned right toward a tree And all of a sudden, there was a shift and he was back driving on the road again. There was a certain blackout point we referred to as the Leinster effect. After Murray Leinster, there were a lot of novels about the multiverse and this little kind of barrier between one world and another. And in one world, he was probably killed, God forbid. But in this one, he was fine. Now, it's difficult to say this one or that one because we seem to be passing through these worlds all the time. We had a case, or I'd say Ben was just a wee lad, 1998 in Connecticut. I was on a TV show with John Zaffis, whom I'm sure people recognize as Ed Lorraine Warren's nephew. He was a kid in the crowd outside the Bridgeport house in 74.
Wow.
He and I had a lot of fun on this TV show. And someone called in and said they were having these weird footsteps and all this. So I lived a lot closer than John did. So I went over there, ended up spending a night there. And I actually heard these footsteps coming down the stairs into the living room. So the multiverse idea kicked in. And I said to the fella, go on up and come down the same way you do in the morning. Because you do that every day. You probably hit the same steps at the same time, that kind of thing. And he did. And it was just like the sound that had occurred. So my theory was it was him.
He was haunting himself.
He was haunting himself.
That's
yeah.
Awesome.
He did that so often that it was present in so many parallel worlds with similar laws.
Yeah, it was like an imprint. Yeah.
And as soon as he realized that, it all stopped. So a physicist might say that he collapsed the wave function. Yeah. The two worlds were brought together, and no more haunting, if that's what it was.
For me, the whole idea of time not operating the way that we understand it in a linear past, present, future sense, and multiple timelines coexisting simultaneously, that's the hardest part of this theory for me to really feel like I have a good grasp of. Is there anything you can offer to help bring that home?
One of the things that's popular now is the Mandela effect.
Yes.
Okay. That started when people were talking about Nelson Mandela.
Right.
And people were saying, well, he died in prison. But he didn't die in prison. He was released in the 1990s.
And it wasn't just one person. It was a large community of people who all had that memory. Right.
And that got down to alternative. Now, there could be psychological explanations for this. But you get down to Ludwig von Beethoven or Ludwig van Beethoven, the Berenstain Bears, or the Berenstein Bears, et cetera, which I think is fascinating. If you're aware of it, you find it kind of happens all the time. There are little changes in your world, which I think are indicated by the fact that we're passing through world boundaries all the time. One of the darker aspects of that, and I happen to be speaking with a medium recently, and she was all happy. She sent somebody to the light. I said, well, you might want to rethink that, because in our experience, the light is simply the world boundary of another world. It could be it could be a hell world. And somebody goes through that if they can, and you may never hear from them again. Think they're in, heaven, with harps and angels, and you've sent them to a worse place than they were in the first place. So I think that there's that consideration, and the physicality of the whole thing. But one thing you notice in ancient Christian theology, and it's still present in Orthodox theology, is they really, really stress the physicality of things. For example, what they believe about the nature of Christ. Truly God, truly man. Not a spirit, like some of the Gnostics thought, really flesh and blood and really divine, okay? Now, I don't know if Christ would have agreed with that himself, but that's the belief. And what I have noticed among these supposed spirits, all kinds of physical traits. There's another term we use called world families of worlds, where things are a little different from one to the other, but the laws of physics are largely similar, okay? And so you're going to have variations, like Nelson Mandela died in one, didn't in another, but you've still got pretty much the same laws of physics. with this, spirits, as we classically understand them, fully containing personalities of dead people, are not possible. Physicists have told me that. Not possible under the laws of physics. Other universes with different laws, yeah, yes, maybe, probably. But within our world family, that is difficult to achieve. So when we see a ghost, we're assuming, at least Ben and I do, and it works when we work with them, that they are living lives in just a parallel world, and they're afraid of us many times because they think we're ghosts. Why? Because they see us through the world boundary. We look electrical, we glow, this sort of thing. Is what's the world boundary? It seems to be electrically charged plasma. Electromagnetics holds the multiverse together.
Right.
I've run into cases where parasites are operating in several different worlds, picking on several different groups of people. At one point in the Connecticut house, we had to go down to the basement to convince the great grandparents, long gone in this world, but still present in many others, that the woman upstairs was not a ghost haunting them, that it was their great great granddaughter. I don't think I got that, but I mean, the problem's
Wow.
we often on our show, I think we have a kind of bad habit of bad mouthing what we refer to as feral ghost hunters, people who do it as a hobby and get in all kinds of trouble. We get letters from them saying, be nicer to us. We use your theories and are getting all kinds of amazing results. So, all right. So, we're nicer to them, but I still don't think people ought to be doing this as a hobby.
In your experience, have you run into people who have said that they've encountered ghosts of departed loved ones who have an intentionality, that have a message, that are there to tell them something? And how do you think that fits into your theory?
Oh, we run into that all the time. Sometimes it's parasites pretending, being mimics. And there are a lot of things in nature that are mimics. But other times, it's particularly visitation apparitions, as they're traditionally known. It's very plausible. I think there are many worlds, and I think we all feel this all the time, where the laws of physics are such that they can communicate. And love is beyond one universe, That's the whole point of creation. The theology is that God's love was infinite, could not be contained, and burst forth because it couldn't be held back. And how does infinite love manifest itself? In an infinite creation, vis-a-vis the multiverse. I think that many of those examples are legitimate, certainly, are examples of multiversal love. And I think at times, however, we have to realize that it could be another version of yourself communicating with you, as in everybody's got this concept of the higher self in one form or another, guardian angels or whatever. And it could be, you could be your own guardian angel. On the other hand, I have frequently run into ancestors who are in places and times where they are aware. I'll give you a rather beautiful example. Now, I don't know if this is really who it seemed to be, but it was in Portland, Maine, and there was a young girl who was they were having poltergeist issues. I went up there. It turned out it was, to me, a parasite, and I started to instruct the family, but the girl was really terrified. She was the one who was being picked on. I said, is there an ancestor you're particularly devoted to? And it turned out that she was very, very devoted to her, I guess it was her great grandfather, who had been an admiral in the Union Navy in the Civil War. But not the guy you'd think of off the top of your head, So she had a picture of him. And my initial advice is always to a family: come together, have positive love, feelings, faith, whatever that turns off the food supply for parasites. but she was so terrified she couldn't deal with it. But Admiral Henry Walk was his name. She could deal with that. She slept with his picture under her bed, under her pillow. She would think about him, talk to him. All of a sudden, I got a phone call, and the whole family had witnessed this. They said it was a beautiful thing that the poltergeist had attacked her one night, tearing covers off her bed, knocking stuff off shelves. And all of a sudden, they all saw a rod of light, as they called it. She interpreted it as the sword, officer's sword that he wore at his side with his uniform, swept the room. There was a beautiful kind of feeling, some thumping on the wall. Poltergeist never heard from again.
Wow.
So
that's extraordinary.
Whether that was actually great grandpa, I don't know, but it certainly seemed like it to them.
Yeah.
Very positive thing. And when I address audiences with people with Asian heritage, they know exactly what I'm talking about with ancestors. Westerners, not so much. But I think that the whole idea of love from beyond, as it were, is great. And one more word on that. In 2011, my mother translated. I don't believe in death, so we don't even use the word. Translated is an ancient concept. And she was 95. And people, people always write in for advice on when they lost loved ones, things of this kind.
Yeah.
And a lot of people wrote in and said, okay, wise guy, how do you deal with it yourself? And I said, it's not that she is still with us, but that we are with her in many, many worlds where she never translated, because those are always existing. I have a better relationship now than I did, when I was like a kid, because there's understanding, there is unity, there is lots and lots of love. Not that there wasn't before, but in an entirely transcendent way when you approach it and when you're multiverse aware. That's our opinion and that's our experience.
I love the whole framework, especially how elegantly the one statement you made a moment ago is that if we have a God of infinite love, then how would he respond in an infinite fashion? So there isn't a conflict. Any of the pearl clutchers out there who feel like we can't have a conversation that's theological in nature and paranormal in nature without creating some kind of tension or unresolvable conflict. You've created a way to think about this that is very satisfying, no matter which side of the spectrum you're leaning toward on any given day. Not to say, well, you're absolutely right or you're absolutely wrong, just to say this feels comfortable to me. There's a lot of peace, I think, available in exposing yourself to this whole way of approaching things. For me, I had a very tumultuous relationship with the church. And I spent 17 years living a very, very devout life. And during that time, I felt that it was necessary, that it was demanded of me to abandon what had been my previous 40 years of existence being interested in these areas. I was writing science fiction and horror at the time. I was always interested in the paranormal. I was always looking at anything supernatural in nature. I had a fascination for it. And then I decided to, give my life to Christ. And I felt that the church was telling me, listen, you need to make a choice. It's going to be one or the other. And I did. I mean, I threw away books and DVDs. I stopped talking about my interest in this area because my entire social community was now made up of people that this was taboo, just for it not to be. And when I ultimately left the church, and when I did, I felt free to come back to this area of interest. What I'm loving is that there isn't anybody any longer telling me that I need to make a choice. I can freely spend time thinking about what I believe and what I don't believe, and what I'm certain about and not certain about. And I can think about these things, and I can watch a horror movie if I want to, and I can talk to people like you and the others in this series, and it doesn't in any way threaten what is still the core of my faith. So there's value in that. just doing the thought experiment, I think it's freeing. Why would you want to ascribe yourself to a doctrine that imprisons you, imprisons your mind, and tells you you're not allowed to think about things? You're not allowed to explore things. You're not allowed to use the mind that God gave you, to work it out instead of just swallowing a red pill or a blue pill, so to speak. For anybody that either has having experiences like the ones we've talked about here today, or people who are fascinated by the multiverse theory and how it may apply in these circumstances, you have a book that you've written. Would you tell us what it is and where it can be gotten for anybody who might be interested to take a deep dive?
Sure. My last book under my own byline was Dancing Past the Graveyard, Parasites, Parallel Worlds, and God. That can be obtained from Amazon, of course. It's in some bookstores. Then Ben and I wrote a book called Behind the Paranormal, Everything You Know Is Wrong, and that's available in some stores too, Amazon, etc. And our website is behindtheparanormal.com, coming up at our 1000th show in 2023. And 15 years we've been on the air, and we're real grateful for that.
And so when you say your show, this is an internet-based podcast radio program. How would you describe what you're doing and where it can be heard?
Oh, it's actually based on a Boston Providence AM/FM radio station.
Mm-hmm.
It's called Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno. But it streams tunein.com and Paranormal Radio app from TalkStream Live. And they're also on Apple Podcasts and all iTunes and all that.
I'll have some links in the show notes that'll point people to both. I did purchase my own copy of Dancing Past the Graveyard. I haven't had a chance to dive into it because it's holiday season right now when we're recording. Right. But I look at it every day and just salivate. I can't wait to really sink my teeth into it and just soak it all into my consciousness. I'm very excited about that. I have so enjoyed this conversation, Paul. I'm very grateful that you made time for me today. I know you have a little bit of a cold going on there, so that you're willing to talk to me for this long, even though you're probably not feeling your best. That's not lost on me. I'm honored. I'm grateful. And I honestly hope that there's a reason for us to reconnect at some point in the future.
Anytime, Lynn. Thank you very much.
I want to thank Paul Eno from the bottom of my heart. I am telling you, this man is my spirit animal. And I could have talked to him for a week and not been through with questions and not been any less delighted to be engaged on a level such as that. He has had a very interesting life and a very different one, and it's given him a perspective that I find absolutely inexhaustibly fascinating. So I hope you did too. I hope to bring more conversations of this level your way. Now that we've wrapped up the Personal Paranormal Encounters series, we're going to take a break from series for a while. I've got several interviews just waiting to be released for you. We're going to talk to poets, artists, scientists, therapists, all kinds of people. And I'm just going to bring them to you as I find them, as I have these interesting conversations with interesting people in hopes of inspiring just deeper thought in you on a wide variety of topics. So I do hope you'll continue along the journey. The first 2 seasons have yielded some very heartening feedback, and I'm very glad about that. We're going to keep this ball rolling. My parting thought today, I thought that I would trot out an old classic. I mean, we need to get back to the brilliant people that wrote to us long ago, whose voices are still just as relevant and just as meaningful today. So it's F. Scott Fitzgerald. How many of you read F. Scott Fitzgerald in high school? How many of you were supposed to read F. Scott Fitzgerald in high school and then didn't because you were lazy? If you're watching on video, you see my hand go up right now. I was lazy. Actually, I was reading the stuff I wanted to read and not the stuff that my teachers told me I was supposed to read. Rebel then, rebel now. But I have somehow found my way back to F. Scott Fitzgerald. And this is just a little quote today, but it's beautiful. And I thought it was a great way to wrap up this conversation. He says the following: "It was only a sunny smile, and little it cost in the giving. But like morning light, it scattered the night and made the day worth living." I want to leave you today with the very thought that just a little smile from you could actually make someone's day. Go ahead and do that. I will. Until next time, I want to say thanks for listening. Come on back, and I will see you next time. Cool Gray in Studio A is a fine-tuned services production. It exists for entertainment purposes and is not intended to be used as a sole source of information or advice on any subject. Find and follow this podcast at coolgraystudios.com.